Hello, all. Tonight I'm going to talk about one of my favorite erotic horror movies, which has become something of a cult hit. I liked it from the first. It was not very well received by the critics. It, it was kind of panned, and people said it was boring. One person said it's beautiful on the outside, but it's hollow on the inside, and I don't agree with that, and I'll tell you why in this room. That's 1983's The Hunger, which is the directorial debut of Tony Scott, the younger brother of Ridley Scott. Um, and It stars David Bowie, Susan Sarandon, Catherine Deneuve, Cliff DeYoung, Dan Hedeya, and Beth Ehlers primarily. And Was written from a novel by Whitley Strieber, but the screenplay was written by Ivan Davis and Michael Thomas. Um, it was released by MGM UA, and it made a decent box office. It made 12.3 million for, I think the investment was it cost 3 million to make. There's some really terrific special effects, and I believe it won a Saturn Award for those special effects. Um, it also won some awards at Cannes, actually, but wasn't well received for some reason I really don't understand. But it has some terrific things in it. For one thing, and I think this is one of the reasons it's become a cult film. Over the opening titles, Bauhaus plays their iconic hit "Bela Lugosi's Dead" live at this nightclub where the two main characters are introduced. And it is really a terrific version. It's not the full long album version, which I prefer, but it's got all the lyrics. And again, Peter Murphy had all his hair back then, so that was kind of cool. And uh, it has a very goth feel. The entire movie has a goth feel, although most of the music they use is classical. Uh, but there are some, pop hits in it as well. Um, it's the story of a couple, John and Miriam Blaylock, who are young and attractive, and they pick up young, kind of uh, goth people at a club, and they take them back home and seduce them, and then they kill them in a unique way. They wear gold Ankh medallions around their necks, and the Ankh conceals a knife, and they use the knife to slit the person's throat and then drink their blood. Uh, though they do not ever actually use the term vampire in the movie at all, but it becomes evident that they are. And then when they're finished with their victims, they burn them in the incinerator down in the basement of this big, huge New York building that they own apparently by themselves. Um, and It becomes the secondary plot is that there's a doctor who is played by Susan Sarandon, and Sarah Roberts is her name in the film, and Dr. Roberts is trying to correlate sleep and longevity, and is trying to figure out if she can find a way to reverse aging or to turn back the clock somehow. And she's doing some studies with monkeys. I will mention one thing about this movie that might be a bit of a turnoff for some. There is some graphic, gory violence, particularly in a scene where a monkey attacks another monkey. And I'm not going to go into that, but if it's obviously just special effects, as they obviously did not and could not use a real monkey for that scene. But if you're sensitive to what I would call extreme gore, do not watch that scene because it's kind of disgusting. It's frightening and shocking, and it's meant to be, but there is a correlation, and that is that it turns out that Dr. Roberts has found a way to tamper with the clock, but she can only move it forward, as we see in another kind of gross scene where she ages a monkey something like 97 years in 2 hours. And it just turns into a skeleton, and the skeleton collapses and just turns into dust. Uh, so there is some correlation here. Um, anyway, John and Miriam Blaylock, as played by David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve, who I think is one of the most beautiful women who ever existed, uh, and fantastic actress on top of it. Very, very talented. uh, played this couple, John and Miriam Blaylock, and we see in the beginning, Bowie asks, or John rather asks Miriam, forever? She says, yes, forever, my love. But it turns out that what she means by that is different than what we think. She is a vampire. John is not. He is one of her victims who has become a vampire. He's acquired the hunger, quote unquote. He has to have blood, which is what the hunger is in this movie. But she gave him eternal life, but not eternal youth. And that, I think, is a deliberate reference certainly by Whitley Strieber, if not by the screenwriters, to the conundrum of the oracle at Delphi in Greece, who had asked the gods for eternal life, but forgot to ask for eternal youth, so she turned into this wizened old woman. And when one of her people who come to seek her, fortune-telling skills says, well, what do you want, Oracle? And she says, I want to die. And of course she can't die because she asked for immortality and was given to it, which is kind of a warning, be careful what you ask for. So anyway, John begins to age rather prematurely and goes to see Dr. Roberts at her clinic and tells her, I don't know what's going on. Could you test my blood? I seem to be aging, very rapidly. My hair is coming out in my hand, and I'm only 35, and look at me, I look like I'm 50. And she doesn't believe him. She thinks he's just a crackpot. And she tells him, I'll be back in 15 minutes. I've got a conference. And we see the conference, which is, where she's talking to Cliff DeYoung, who's her boyfriend, and another doctor. And they're discussing this aging process in the monkeys and what happened with the monkey that attacked and ate its mate, who it apparently had loved. And the reason is because they'd been depriving it of sleep. And that somehow sped up the clock, made it older, and it made it old and angry. And they don't quite understand that. Then finally, we see Bowie waiting in the lobby, and he's starting to become an old man right before our eyes. The makeup effects in this film are incredible. And I believe they won a special award for a Saturn Award for Best Makeup Effects, and richly deserved. So when Dr. Roberts comes back out, he's this old man, and he says, you disappointed me. You said you'd be 15 minutes, and you were 2 hours, and, you let me down. And he walks out, and she says, wait, I didn't believe you, and tries to catch up with him. Well, she can't. He's gone. And later, there was a girl who was played by actress Beth Ehlers, who was best known for being a soap opera star, oddly, but played a young girl in this who they are tutoring in classical music. And they play classical music with her in one of the earlier scenes. And she comes over to basically just to tell Miriam that she can't make it. Sees John in his aged state and says, are you John's father? And he says, no, I'm just a friend of theirs. And we see him sneaking up behind her with the Ankh. Every time they pull out one of these Ankh knives, there's a really cool special sound effect, which is like, whoosh, and you hear that whoosh sound every time they pull the Ankh blade out, which I thought was very cool. An interesting choice by Tony Scott for sound effects. There's some interesting sound effects in the movie. But anyway, he kills her and drinks her blood and then puts her in the incinerator. And later on, a private detective played by Dan Hedeya comes over looking for her, or a police detective, I should say, and asks John about it. Have you seen her? And he says, no. I'm just a friend of theirs. I don't know, where she is or who she is. So he's lying, but then. As soon as Sarandon shows back up at the house and is looking to talk to John, and I'm missing something. Oh, I missed it. Miriam tells John the truth, that she gave him eternal life, but not eternal youth, and that there's nothing she can do about it. She can't reverse the effect. And he says, well, then kill me. She says, our kind can't die. And, you know that. And he just becomes weaker and weaker. And finally, he's so weak that she can physically carry him. She carries him up to the third floor of this building through in a freight elevator and puts him in what's basically a coffin, but it's basically just a box, and nails it shut. And you see her patting other boxes and says, this is John, and be kind to him, all my old loves. So all of her vampiric victims, going all the way back to Egypt, when we see a flashback of her as an Egyptian, uh, are given eternal life, but not eternal youth. That is the curse of submitting to her vampiric will, as it were. Um, so Dr. Roberts later shows up at the house and is asking to see John, and Miriam says, he's not here. He went to. She just lies and says he went to Amsterdam. She says Amsterdam, but I just saw him, yesterday at my clinic, and I'm really very concerned about him, and I wanted to see if I could help him. And she says, well, you can't help him, go away, basically. And she does, but she's kind of curious about what's going on, and all of a sudden she starts feeling these weird things, like she's walking in traffic and she just feels compelled, and she sees Miriam's face in her head, and obviously Miriam is using her vampiric powers to entrance her, because again she's attracted to her, and she's compelled basically to come back to the apartment. You see the scene where she's in a phone booth and she's making a call to Cliff DeYoung to try to talk to him about what's going on, and this strange discovery that she's made, and she can't get through. He's not there, and she's trying to leave a message. She's very frustrated. And these two guys are trying to hit on her, and she just acts like completely weird. Like she starts, jumping, and like, because she's seeing these images of Miriam in her head, and they say, "Oh man, she's just a junkie. Let's get out of here." They leave her alone, and she goes back to the apartment and asks to be let in, and Miriam lets her in. She's playing a interesting musical piece on the piano and just talking to her. She's not doing anything overtly trying to seduce her, but she's playing a song called Lakme by Delibes, and Lakme is a story of a Brahmin, Indian princess, and her slave named Malika, who went down by a river and tried to trace its source. And she tells Susan Sarandon this, and she says, "Is that a love story?" She says, "I told you it's about two women." And she says, "But it sounds like a love story to me." She says, "Well, then I suppose it is." She says, "Mrs. Blaylock, are you making a pass at me?" And she says, "Not that I'm aware of." And then they're drinking wine, and in a sort of cliched scene, Susan Sarandon, who is for some reason only wearing a rather flimsy t-shirt with no bra, spills wine on her breast, basically, and has to, take the t-shirt off so that it can be washed. And after that point, Miriam seduces her. That love scene is one of the most incredibly erotic scenes I have ever seen filmed, and if I ever meet Susan Sarandon, I'm going to tell her, I'm jealous of you for one thing: you got to kiss Catherine Deneuve. And it's very well shot. It's not tasteless, it's not porn, it's a very erotic scene, and it's handled very well. And in that scene, there's an important scene where she drinks some of Miriam's blood from biting her elbow, and Miriam drinks some of her blood. After that incident, she goes back to work. She goes back to the lab, and she takes a blood test of herself and looks at it under the microscope, and it's very strange. It doesn't look like human blood. One of her colleagues says there are two different strains of blood in here, and one of them is trying to dominate the other one, and the one that's trying to become dominant is not human, and I don't know what it is. That's Miriam's blood. She's a vampire. She's not human. And that blood is starting to take over uh, Sarah, and she's starting to freak out a bit, and she goes and tries to, kind of hash things out with uh, Miriam. And I don't remember how exactly it happens, but again, they're starting to make love, and Susan grabs the ankh from Miriam's neck and stabs her with it and drinks her blood, and a lot of it. And now, all of a sudden, we see the effect that happened to John, the sudden rapid aging, starts happening to Miriam. And because, again, Sarah basically usurped her power. She took drank her blood, and has now allowed the vampiric blood to take over hers, and it gives that power, transfers it from Miriam to her. We see all of her old loves emerge, and this is kind of a scary scene as these wizened old gray beings, or somewhat skeletal, but they still have enough flesh on them. They're advancing on Miriam in the attic, and she's starting to scream, and eventually she falls through a skylight, hits the floor, and is, if not killed, is like knocked out. And now, because all of her power has been usurped, all of these old beings, including John, what remains of him, crumble into dust, literally. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. I've never seen that in a vampire movie, that the victims would crumble into dust. We saw Dracula crumble to dust a couple of times in the Hammer films, but not his victims. Then finally, in the last scene of the movie, Sarah and two young lovers who apparently she has seduced are hanging out in her apartment in London, which overlooks St. Paul's Cathedral. And you see a kind of a red sunset, and you hear very faintly Miriam's voice screaming, "Sarah, Sarah," and you see that she's in a coffin in another room hidden in the apartment. So the tables have turned, and I thought that was really good. I think it's an interesting movie. It's weird, it's scary, it's strange, just strange. It's beautiful in the way that it's shot, and as I said, the love scenes between Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve are incredibly erotic. And I think it's a really, really good movie, and I highly recommend it. It isn't surprising to me that it has become a cult hit.